What's a red flag everyone should be aware of when attending a job interview? Dodging a bullet by bringing up Glassdoor reviews. During one interview, I mentioned the company's bad Glassdoor reviews, and the interview ended immediately, followed by a rejection email within minutes. It was shocking, but in hindsight, it felt like a bullet dodged because their defensive reaction confirmed what the reviews had warned about the toxic environment. Questioning the real reason behind the vacancy. I asked during an interview why the position was always being advertised, and the interviewer got incredibly defensive, even raising her voice. It made me realize something was definitely off, and I walked away from that opportunity knowing I'd saved myself from a potentially bad job experience. Not the job you applied for? Leave! I once went in for an interview only to be told the position I applied for wasn't available, but they had something similar. That similar position was for a much lower salary, and they hoped I'd accept just because I'd shown up. I left immediately, knowing it was a bait-and-switch tactic. Vague or non-existent job descriptions. During an interview, the hiring manager couldn't give me a clear description of the job. Every time I asked for specifics, they dodged the question, making me feel like they were hiding something. When a company can't be upfront about what they need you to do, that's a sign you're walking into a chaotic situation. Unpaid overtime in disguise. At one interview, I was told, overtime isn't mandatory, but most people stay late. It became clear that working extra hours without pay was an unspoken expectation, and I wasn't about to sacrifice my work-life balance for a company that didn't respect my time. Hey everyone! Have you ever dodged a bullet during a job interview by asking the right questions or noticing red flags? It's wild how much you can uncover with a little digging, and sometimes walking away is the best decision. Have you had a similar experience? Share your stories in the comments. I'd love to hear how you've navigated tricky interviews. If you're into these discussions about career tips, self-empowerment, and recognizing red flags, hit that subscribe button. Let's keep the conversation going, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss out on helpful advice. Investing your own money into the job. I had an interview where they said I'd need to purchase my own laptop or training materials, and they'd help by deducting the cost from my paycheck. That's a major red flag. Any company that expects you to pay for tools to do the job is not looking out for your best interests. Poor treatment of employees. I once interviewed for a job where the employees all seemed miserable. They mentioned in passing that the previous person had left after only a few months, and the people I met looked stressed and overworked. It became obvious that this company wasn't a place where anyone could thrive for long. The mandatory overtime lie. When they said overtime wasn't mandatory, but hinted that everyone sticks around after hours, I knew they were lying. Companies that expect you to stay late without officially requiring it are exploiting their workers, and I wasn't about to get caught in that trap. Questioning salary and getting a lower offer. I applied for a job with a certain salary range, but when I got to the interview, they suddenly changed the number to something much lower. It felt deceptive, and I immediately walked out, realizing that if they were shady about pay up front, it wouldn't get better later. Defensive responses to salary discussions. One time, an interviewer got defensive when I asked about salary, saying they would only discuss it after I signed paperwork. That kind of secrecy around pay is a huge red flag. Any company unwilling to talk compensation early on is likely to be underpaying its employees. Fake job titles and responsibilities. I accepted a job with a management title, but when I started, the role didn't involve any managerial responsibilities, and the pay was far below what had been promised. When I brought it up, they admitted they didn't really need a manager, but hoped I'd take on the work for a lower salary. I left quickly after realizing they were misleading from the start. Unrealistic expectations for pay and work. One time, I was told, "We only hire the best of the best." But when I asked about pay, they were offering minimum wage. It's laughable how many companies want top-tier talent but aren't willing to pay anything close to what those skills are worth. Pressure to sign documents. Without reading. During the onboarding process, they pressured me to sign forms without reading them. Every time I paused to read something, someone would say, "It's just standard stuff, don't worry." That's a huge red flag, because a company that doesn't want you to understand your rights is likely hiding something. Deflecting concerns about reviews. When I brought up some negative employee reviews I'd found online, they spent the entire interview defending themselves instead of discussing my qualifications. It felt like they were more interested in protecting their image than in genuinely addressing my concerns, which made me question their integrity. Inappropriate interview questions. During one interview, they asked for my political opinions, which felt completely irrelevant to the job. It made me uncomfortable, and I left knowing that a company willing to cross those boundaries in an interview would likely have more serious issues with respecting employee privacy. Manipulating pay based on previous jobs. I once declined to tell an interviewer my current salary, and they insisted, saying they based offers on previous earnings. It was obvious they were trying to lowball me by relying on what other companies had gotten away with, and I wasn't about to play along. Unqualified management in long-term positions. At a company I worked for, there was an employee who had been there for over 15 years, and the rest of us had been there for 3 years or less. That employee turned out to be toxic, driving everyone else away but staying on because they knew how to manipulate the system. It made for a miserable work environment. Holding personal information as leverage. In one interview, they asked to hold my ID while I was on site, and it felt incredibly strange. I declined and left because no company should need to hold onto your personal documents. It felt controlling and unnecessary, and I'm glad I followed my gut on that one. Rigid company hierarchies, with no room for growth. At one company, I noticed that all the employees were either brand new or had been there for decades, with no one in between. It became clear that there was no room for career growth, and those who stayed long-term had simply given up on advancing their careers. Aggressively pushing non-existent roles. I once interviewed for a design position, but when I arrived, they told me the job was no longer available and offered me a sales role instead. The bait-and-switch tactic made me feel like they didn't respect my time or qualifications, so I walked out. Lack of respect for employee boundaries. During an interview, they made it clear that clock watchers weren't appreciated and that they expected people to stay late regularly. When companies don't respect your work-life balance, it's a sign that they don't value their employees' time or well-being. Dishonesty about compensation. I applied for a job that listed a certain salary range, but once I got to the interview, the number they offered was significantly lower. It's a clear sign of a company that will try to cheat you out of fair compensation if they're dishonest from the start. Refusing to discuss salary until after signing. When I asked about salary during one interview, they said it would only be discussed after I signed the contract. That's a huge red flag because any company that won't be upfront about pay is probably hiding something or planning to offer less than expected. Being asked for financial investment. I once applied for a sales job, and they told me I'd have to buy my own laptop or have it deducted from my paychecks. It was a clear scam, and I left immediately because no legitimate employer should ask you to fund the tools needed to do the job. Toxic long-term employees. Driving people away. At one job, there was a senior employee who had been there for years, but they were the reason everyone else kept leaving. They created a toxic environment by bullying newer employees while protecting themselves through seniority, which made the workplace unbearable. Sinking ship signs. During the interview. In one interview, I was told the person previously in the role had quit after a few months, and all the people I spoke to seemed stressed and overworked. It became clear that the company had a high turnover rate and was struggling to retain talent, which was a major red flag. Undervaluing the work you'll be doing. During an interview, they kept downplaying how difficult the job would be, saying it was easy and not that important. If a company underestimates the value of the role they're hiring for, they're likely to underpay and overwork you once you're on board. Focusing only on workload. A major red flag in job interviews is when they don't focus on your skills or experience, but instead fixate on your willingness to work long hours or handle heavy workloads. It's a strong indicator that they expect you to overwork and may not value a healthy work-life balance. Grim replacement plans. I once had an interviewer casually mention they were looking to replace an employee who was dying of cancer. The coldness in their tone, combined with the fact that they were actively trying to force the person out before she even passed away, was chilling. It showed a complete lack of compassion, and I knew I had to get out of there fast. We're like a family. If a company claims to be like a family, it's often a sign that they expect you to be available 24/7 and put your job above your personal life. I once worked for a place like that, and it turned out to be toxic. They expected emotional loyalty in exchange for professional exploitation, and when I finally left, I knew I wouldn't fall for that line again. Dodging salary conversations. During one interview, I realized the company was being very cagey about salary. Later, I found out from internal emails that they had a much higher budget but underpaid me simply because they could. If they're dodging the salary conversation up front, it's a red flag that they might not be transparent about compensation. 3 jobs for the price of 1. I once applied for a specific role, only to be told during the interview that I'd also need to take on several unrelated responsibilities. Essentially, they wanted me to do 3 jobs, but only pay me for 1. It's a classic bait-and-switch tactic, and it's best to avoid any company that does this. Asking personal questions. I had an interviewer ask if I'd ever been an addict, which seemed wildly inappropriate and invasive. Additionally, if they react negatively when you ask why the position is open or what happened to the last person who held it, that's a sure sign they're hiding something toxic about the workplace. Buzzword bingo. One red flag I've learned to recognize is when the interviewer throws around vague buzzwords instead of answering your questions directly. If they can't explain what you'd actually be doing, it usually means the job will either be incredibly dull or they'll expect you to be a jack of all trades. The family business trap. When a company says, "We're like a family," it often means that only actual family members benefit from raises or promotions. I've been in situations where nepotism was rampant, and as an outsider, I was expected to take on extra work while relatives got the rewards. Work hard, play hard is code for no boundaries. If a company emphasizes a work hard, play hard culture, it often means you'll be working late nights regularly, and the so-called play is mandatory socializing at the bar. It's not fun if you don't drink or value your personal time, and leaving early or skipping out is often frowned upon. Promises of bonuses that never come. One time, an HR rep kept emphasizing the company's performance bonuses whenever I asked about a pay raise. I later found out from colleagues that those bonuses were almost never awarded, and it was just a way to avoid paying competitive wages. If they focus too much on potential bonuses instead of guaranteed pay, be wary. Nobody wants to work anymore. When a company complains that nobody wants to work anymore, it's usually a sign that they're offering terrible pay and poor working conditions. Every time I've heard that phrase during an interview, it turned out to be a toxic environment where they exploited employees for as little as possible. Pushing for self-starter roles. A company once kept emphasizing that they needed a self-starter for a role that didn't seem to require it. This usually means there's no support system in place, and they expect you to figure everything out on your own in a chaotic, disorganized environment. It's often a sign of high turnover and poor management. Being late to the interview. If the interviewer is late, it's a sign they don't respect your time. It works both ways. If you wouldn't get hired for being late, you shouldn't accept a job where they don't even value punctuality during the interview process. Lowballing. During the interview, I once had an interviewer who offered me a salary far below what I had expected, and then asked if I was willing to do everything possible to make the company successful. It was clear they wanted to underpay and overwork me, and I quickly realized that wasn't a place I wanted to be. When they only like the pay. At the end of an interview, I asked the interviewer what she liked about working at the company. Her answer? I like the pay. It was a clear signal that the workplace culture was probably terrible, and I was glad to have asked that question. Always remember, you're interviewing the company too. Negative talk about former employees. One of the biggest red flags is when the interviewer starts bad-mouthing former employees or the person who previously held the position. If they're willing to talk badly about others, chances are they'll do the same to you, which is a sign of a toxic work environment. Invasive questions about your personal life. I once had an interviewer ask me about my marital status and if I had kids. When I said no, they responded with good. It was unsettling and made it clear they didn't want to hire anyone with family responsibilities, which was a huge red flag. Mandatory fun time. A company that enforces mandatory after-work social events is a red flag for me. I once had a job where attendance at these fun events was compulsory, and if you left early, it would come up in your next performance review. It was exhausting and felt like a complete invasion of my personal time. Lack of praise for employees. One time, I asked the interviewer to tell me about a time when an employee really impressed them, and they couldn't think of a single example. In contrast, my current job gave me multiple examples, which made me realize how much they valued their staff. Questions about your family. Another red flag is when interviewers ask questions that are generally considered off-limits, like your marital status, religion, or whether you have kids. These questions are usually designed to figure out how much of your personal life will interfere with your availability to the company. Refusal to discuss salary. If the company refuses to discuss salary during the interview, it's a red flag that they're either planning to offer below market rates or don't respect transparency. One time, I was deep into an interview process when I realized they were intentionally avoiding the topic of compensation, and I knew it was time to walk away. Personal belongings confiscation. In one interview, they made me put my cell phone in a bucket at the front of the office, saying it was to reduce productivity issues. It felt incredibly controlling, and I decided on the spot that I didn't want to work for a company that treated employees like children. Sobbing employees. Walking into an interview and seeing an employee visibly upset at their desk is a massive red flag. In one case, I also noticed there was a wet bar in the office kitchen, which suggested that alcohol was being used to cope with the stress of the job. Disregard for former employees. A big red flag is when an interviewer talks negatively about former employees or the person who previously held the position. If they're willing to badmouth others, it's likely they'll do the same to you down the line. Good to be without a family. I had an interviewer ask if I was married or had kids. When I said no, they responded with good. It made it obvious they didn't want to hire anyone who might need time off for family commitments, which was a huge red flag. Sudden group interviews. I was once told I'd be having a one-on-one interview, but when I logged into the Zoom call, they announced we were waiting for the other candidates to join. It was a bait and switch, and I immediately knew I didn't want to work for a company that wasn't upfront from the beginning. Relief when you show up. A subtle red flag can be when the interviewer seems almost too relieved that you showed up. I once had an interview where they told me that several other candidates claimed they couldn't find the building. While it could have just been a hard-to-locate office, their eagerness for anyone to show up made me question why the role was so difficult to fill. Silencing female leaders. I've also seen interviews where a question directed at a female leader was hijacked by the male CEO, not allowing her to speak. This happened when my ex applied for a manager role. She asked the female leader about her experiences in the company, but the CEO jumped in to answer for her. That said a lot about the dynamics in that workplace. Bait and switch. Another red flag is when companies change the role you applied for once you arrive. I once walked into an interview thinking I was applying for a marketing position, only to be handed an alphabetization and basic math test. By the end, they asked if I'd be willing to work with patients. The entire job posting had been about social media management, so it was clear they were pulling a bait and switch. We're a family means exploitation. When a company says, "We're a family here," it can often be a veiled way of saying, "We're going to take advantage of you." I had this happen during an interview, and I learned the hard way that it was code for expecting you to work long hours with no extra pay and to never push back on unreasonable demands. Disregard for wage transparency. I've also encountered situations where companies openly complain about wage transparency laws. One interviewer told me they didn't like how their state required wage transparency because it only caused trouble. He also made it clear that they wouldn't stop employees from talking about their wages, but seemed ready to retaliate if someone did. It was a clear sign of a toxic work culture. Hired on the spot? Be cautious. Being hired on the spot might sound great, but it can also be a red flag. I used to think it meant I was a fantastic candidate. Later, I realized that in most cases, it was because they were desperate to fill the role due to high turnover. The jobs where I had to wait a bit for an offer ended up being much more stable and enjoyable. Overloaded job descriptions. A common red flag is when the job description you're given during the interview doesn't match what you were told beforehand. I once showed up for an interview that was supposed to be one-on-one, only to find myself in a conference hall with hundreds of other applicants. It quickly became clear that the job was not as advertised, and the whole process was degrading. Love bombing by narcissistic managers. I've also experienced love bombing from managers during interviews. It feels great at first, but it's usually a sign of a narcissistic manager who's trying to win you over with compliments before the real toxicity comes out once you're hired. High turnover and vague answers. If the company can't give clear answers about its culture or job expectations, or if the turnover rate seems suspiciously high, it's a red flag. I once asked about the high turnover at a company, and they dodged the question, which later made sense when I saw how quickly people left. Micromanagement in disguise. Some interviewers claim they're not micromanagers, But when you dig deeper, you find that they have systems in place to track every little thing their team does. One interviewer said he wasn't a micromanager, yet he expected weekly reports, ticket updates, and forms filled out daily. Just because the micromanagement is automated doesn't make it any less controlling. Unpaid group interview. A job once asked me to come in for a third round of interviews, which turned out to be an all-day group project with other candidates. They wanted us to take a day off work and compete for a position in a group setting. It was degrading, and I declined to participate. Red flag interviews in hotel conference rooms. I once went to an interview that was held in a hotel conference room instead of an office. They said it was because they were doing a lot of hiring, but when I arrived, I found hundreds of applicants and realized it was more of a cattle call than a serious interview. Union questions. Another red flag is when interviewers push you to avoid joining a union. I had an interview where the managers kept talking about how expensive union fees were and assured me they would treat me well enough that I wouldn't need union protection. It felt like a thinly veiled attempt to dissuade me from considering it. Too many rounds of interviews. If a company requires 4 or more rounds of interviews, it's a sign they might have a broken decision-making process. I've had to go through months of interviews for a job, only to realize the company was indecisive and likely had poor management structure. They trash-talk former employees. When you ask why a position is open and the interviewer starts bad-mouthing the person who left, it's a major red flag. I had one interview where the department head couldn't stop talking negatively about the former employee, which gave me a clear insight into how they'd likely treat me. Rushed hiring. If a company wants you to start immediately, it could indicate they're desperate due to a high turnover rate. I once had an interviewer say they needed me to start the next morning. It made me question why they were in such a rush and what had happened to their previous staff. Too long waiting for the interview. I've also learned not to wait too long for an interview to start. If the interviewer keeps you waiting for more than 30 minutes, it's a sign they don't value your time. Once, after waiting for nearly an hour, I politely told the receptionist we'd need to reschedule. If they can't respect your time during the interview, they won't respect it if you're hired. Disorganized management. If the interviewer takes a phone call or gets interrupted during the interview for something that could wait, it's a sign that the company might be disorganized. I've had interviews where the manager kept stepping out to deal with other things, and it was always a red flag that the job would involve a lot of chaos. They joke about turnover. In one interview, the big bosses actually joked about all the people who had been fired or let go over the years. It was meant to be funny, but all it did was confirm that the company had a toxic culture with little job security. Refusing to discuss culture or turnover. If a company dodges questions about turnover or refuses to talk about the work culture, it's a red flag. It shows they're hiding something, usually related to how they treat their employees. Asking for free work. I've had interviews where they asked me to complete a task or project for free during the process. It felt exploitative, and I realized they were just trying to get free labor from candidates without any intention of hiring them, focusing more on their pets than the job. I once had an interviewer who spent more time talking about their dog than the job itself. While small talk is normal, if they avoid discussing the role, it's a sign they're not serious or the job is not as important as they're making it out to be. Weird psychological questions. Some companies ask psychological questions to throw you off during interviews. I once had an interviewer ask me to describe myself in 3 words, which seemed like a way to trip me up rather than assess my skills. Negging your resume. One of the worst interview experiences I had was when the interviewer went line by line through my resume and found a way to belittle every point. It was clear that this person would have been an abusive boss, so I noped out as soon as I could. Unprepared interviewers. If the interviewer hasn't even looked at your resume before you sit down, it's a bad sign. I once had an interview where the hiring manager was reading my resume for the first time right in front of me. It made me feel like they didn't take the process seriously, and I wasn't interested in working for them after that. Red flag. If they talk about fun culture too much. Beware of companies that emphasize their fun culture with foosball tables and game rooms. While it might seem like a perk, I've found that these places usually frown upon using them during working hours. It's a ploy to make you think the environment is laid back, but the reality is often very different. Recruiting for a job you didn't apply for. I once had an interview where the role I was being considered for kept changing as I talked to different people. None of them could give me a clear answer about what the actual job would involve, which left me with the impression that no one really knew what they needed. Being ghosted after multiple interviews. If you go through several rounds of interviews and then hear nothing, it's a sign the company can't make decisions. I've had interviews that spanned months, only for the company to ghost me at the end. It showed a lack of respect for my time and effort. They belittle previous staff. Another red flag is when the interviewer belittles previous staff members during the interview. I once had an interviewer describe former employees in the worst possible terms, which made me realize they probably wouldn't respect me either if I took the job.